My role at SEPA, the Dean Merritt J now, really takes digital and cyber issues very seriously. The way I heard someone say it is, if you go to SICE, then everybody knows you're going to get a lot of econometrics. And I had someone express it as what Dean Janow was trying to do at SEPA was to do the same thing, but for digital and cyber and technology, which I thought was a wonderful way of doing it, that if you come to SEPA, she really wants to maximize your exposure to digital data, cyber kinds of issues. About half of my work is on systemic cyber risks and cybersecurity. What do we do if an IT company that's too big to fail has a Lehman Brothers moment? They're with everyone's data on Friday and gone on Monday. I work a lot with our central bank initiative, Professor Trish Mosser, on cyber risk to financial stability. The other half of and we're doing a hacker film festival. So we're trying to do all sorts of interesting and cool stuff. My other half of my work is on cyber conflict, cyber warfare, and what it means to us. And that's where this is going to be. Today's talk is going to be about. 2/3 of my students are ISP, International Security Program. The rest will come from the different areas, especially IFEP, the International Finance and Economics, because there are a lot of great jobs in the banks if you understand cyber. The talk is, I drink your milkshake in cyberspace, and we'll kind of get to what I mean by that as we go along. And so sorry for the kind of having the kawaii sort of milkshakes here. I actually originally used those for a talk to the Pentagon, and it worked with them, surprisingly. So when I talk a lot about cyber conflict, I'll rarely talk about cyber war, because we haven't really had anything like a cyber war. As far as we know, no one has directly died from a cyber attack. Indirectly, sort of. But not directly from the cyber attack itself. And so war doesn't strike us just yet as the right way to talk about it. Oh, but conflict, definitely. So for me, I say the first cyber conflict was, goes back a while. Cliff Stoll wrote about it in this fabulous book, The Cuckoo's Egg. It was actually an espionage case where he talked about the advantages of using computers for espionage rather than having to use traditional spies. And this framing of these advantages are still the things that we hear today, but actually go back to 1988. The case itself was in 1986, and it was an absolutely fascinating case. Cuckoo's Egg was one of the very first books that I read when I was getting into this space 22 years ago. Because Cliff is a fantastic writer, but he's not an author. He's actually an astronomer, a PhD astronomer, and he was at America's national labs doing unclassified work. And one day in 1986, he came across a 75-cent billing error. Right now, the internet's almost too cheap to meter. But back then, in his national lab, he understood technology a little bit more than everyone else, so they made him the system administrator. They're like, you know what, you're a geek, you understand tech, you understand Unix, fine, you do this. And he had to figure out who was using, which department was using the internet and the other networks they had more, and they would have to build them more based on that. And he caught this billing error. He said, that's weird, right? Computers should either be right all of the time or catastrophically wrong. So he dove in to try and figure out where this billing error came from. And as he dove in, he found out that he had a hacker in his system. And the hacker was trying to cover their tracks so they couldn't be found, but they didn't cover the tracks exactly right. And that led to the 75-cent discrepancy, which was the network activity of the hacker itself. And so this national lab is in Berkeley, California. So of course he figured, this must be those crazy students over at Berkeley, what with their music and their hair. And then he goes and he looks, wait a minute. This hacker who is going by the name Jaeger was going through his systems and out to defense industrial companies like Lockheed Martin And they were breaking in through his systems, like going through his systems to break into Air Force bases. And they were looking for terms like secret, top secret, satellite, laser, nuclear rockets, like ICBM. And he realized, oh my God, this person is after the information from Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. I don't have hackers, I've got spies. And Cliff Stoll invented all of this amazing technology. Like, he invented something that we call now a honeynet. They invented it. He set up an entire fake department in his national lab. It was like the Department of Special Projects, which is what we in the US, what people in the government say for like the things that are really classified. And he had an administrator just making all of these realistic but totally made up documents so that the hacker would be going through and collecting that. And while the hacker was in the system, Cliff Stoll would be going back farther and see if he could trace where the hacker is coming from. The same kind of stuff that we do today, but Cliff Stoll had to invent it on the fly. They even said, well, you can have access to this engineering document, say on lasers, but you have to write to us at this address. And what do you know? The hackers actually did write to try and gain access to the document. So it gave him more intelligence. And so Cliff, the US government didn't pay any attention to this at the beginning, but finally got involved. And he traced it back to Germany, to Hanover, Germany. It turned out it was just a couple of hackers who were selling their material on to the Soviet KGB for $54,000, the equivalent of $54,000 in cash and drugs. And so absolutely fascinating case. And that's why I wrote the first history book in this field. It's called The Fierce Domain. This is why I call this the first cyber conflict. This dynamic of the back and forth over time between the hackers and the defenders, that doesn't take place in an instant. It takes place over weeks and months and years. You could take Cliff Stoll out of this, out of 1986, and you time warp him forward to 2020, and you give him a little time to understand some changes in technologies, but the methods that Cliff Stoll used would serve him very well tracking down an espionage case today. So even though we say, boy, the internet's moving so quickly inside, you'll see it said a lot that cyber warfare changes so quickly. That's only true on the surface level of technology. The underlying dynamics have been relatively stable. Jump forward something like 20 years. And we had the first really nationally security significant cyber attack. That was a disruption. The Estonians had a statue of a Red Army soldier pictured there in the center that was posted when, in the Soviet view, Estonia was liberated from the Nazis. In the Estonian view, from when they were reinvaded by another neighbor. And it was there, and several unknown soldiers were interred underneath. In the Estonian telling, they didn't really mind the statue when they regained their independence, but it was a flashpoint for Russian nationalists who would frequently gather there to express their discontent in an independent Estonia. And as the statue was on a traffic circle, pretty much downtown, it would disturb traffic. So the Estonians made the decision to move the statue to a Red Army cemetery not too far away. And to American ears, that sounds very reasonable. To Russian ears, that was not reasonable at all. And it led to widespread cyber attacks over weeks in 2007. That essentially forced the Estonians to take themselves offline. Actually, not essentially. It forced the Estonians to take themselves offline, which they were able to do because of their unique internet geography that made it a bit more defensible. And so this was treated as one of the very first real national security wake-up calls, because here you had a NATO ally that was more or less knocked offline because of attacks by Russian nationalists. And by the way, we never found any evidence that the Russian government was behind it. More, the Russian government was kind of encouraging it. wouldn't it be nice? Like, look at what these fascists are doing. The man on the upper right is the Estonian president at the time, who actually grew up only about 7 miles from where I'm sitting. He grew up in New Jersey, and then he went to Columbia College. So he is actually a Columbia grad, and he actually teaches a class where he covers what he did during these times here at SIPA. So if you join us, he'll hopefully still be teaching that class. So he took a lot of lessons from the 2007 case. Now, the two examples I've given both are about Russia. The United States has been active as well. That's the Iranian president reviewing their their centrifuges to refine uranium in the upper left. Those were attacked in a joint US-Israeli operation called Stuxnet. Of course, that's Edward Snowden, and many of you will be at least passingly familiar with what he revealed about what the United States had been up to. We could do this just as easily about China, Iran, North Korea, especially, but I'm using this just to illustrate what I mean by cyber conflict. So what do I mean by I drink your milkshake in cyberspace? There have been a lot of people. When I got involved in this 22 years ago, I was setting up the very first joint cyber command, and that had 22 of us in that cyber command. Now the cyber command has 6,200 people just doing operational roles, not even those that are in staff and headquarters roles. So it's really exploded over the years. So there's a lot in academia and in the governments of the world that are trying to figure out, how is conflict in cyberspace similar or dissimilar to conflict in the air, land, sea, and space? What is it that we can learn from Clausewitz or Sun Tzu or others that apply in this space, and which more dangerously seems like it applies or only applies in some conditions but don't apply in other conditions? And so, having been a practitioner, like having got started as an Air Force intelligence officer doing these jobs, doing it at the White House, doing it at Goldman Sachs, has given me a unique perspective to try and apply to this. So the current US strategy, military strategy, is based around, it's called persistent engagement. It might also be called defend forward. And what persistent engagement found was that, or it starts from the position that as soon as countries connected in the internet, that we were now in constant contact with each other. Right? I mean, there's no border that connects Russia with Berkeley, California. And it would have been very difficult for Russia to get physical spies into Berkeley, California to spy in that lab. But because we have these global interconnected networks, Russia and Berkeley, California, in the United States are now in constant contact, that we have constant contact between the military and the espionage forces, intelligence forces of every country on Earth. For Russia to do a cyber attack on Estonia, or for the United States on Iran, there are no meaningful borders that got crossed to make that happen. And so you have this constant contact, and that it's not episodic like you think of in a normal war, but it's constant. We're always engaged with each other. And so persistent engagement says, therefore, it's imperative to fend forward, to have persistent presence. You can't keep your forces back in their barracks. They have to be out there engaging with the adversaries if you're going to prevail, and if you're going to have, and if you're in fact going to set norms. Like if you want to control cyber conflict, you've got to be out there doing it. And so many of you might be familiar with the movie clip that I'm going to play here, but it is basically a game of I drink your milkshake. And so the fabulous Daniel Day-Lewis.
If you have a milkshake, and I have a milkshake, and I have a straw, there it is, that's a straw, you see. Watch it. And my straw reaches across the room and starts to drink your milkshake. I drink your milkshake. I drink it up.
Now, Daniel Day-Lewis was doing that for oil drilling, and he had set up some oil wells, and he had drilled into the other person's, the hapless person on the left, and had sucked up all of his oil by drilling across the room. And so as I was hearing these people that came up with this, the concept of persistent engagement, it struck me in how much what they were talking about was, I drink your milkshake, right? By saying those Russian spies in 1986 were reaching their straw across the oceans and into those databases at Berkeley, California, and extending that straw into Lockheed Martin and Air Force bases and sucking up the information that they needed. And the United States, you could say, under what the Snowden revelations taught us, what the United States was doing the same, that we had our straws and we were sucking up other people's milkshakes. Now, there's some differences, of course, right? When the NSA was sucking up other people's milkshakes, the original milkshake was still there. And maybe you could extend the analogy farther than you need to say the Russians weren't just, or the Americans with Stuxnet weren't just poisoning Iranian milkshakes, sucking up Iranian milkshakes, but poisoning them. And so what persistent engagement says is, therefore, you can't let this happen. And that the only defense, and they almost use the word only, the primary defense is you have to be out there sucking up the other guy's milkshake and swatting away their straws is the main defense. Okay. No, we got it. Okay. So, but what they have never really done is be clear about the causation. And that's what our job is as academics, right? Especially academics that have been practitioners like me. Try and take this, what the hell do you mean? Because they're writing, the people that wrote this, Emily Goldman, Michael Fisher-Keller, and others, Richard Harknett, it's very difficult to fully understand what they mean. And half the time they're speaking as academics, and the other half the time they're speaking as cheerleaders. So what we tried to do at Columbia is say, all right, let's try and make this clear, and let's try and be clear about the causal arguments they're making. So it starts with the problem. Adversaries are conducting attacks to destabilize us, erode national sources, national power. We're trying to do that too, but, and then the result. The United States, the strategy, they say they both want stability, but also superiority. So going through the strategies and the academic arguments, here's what they seem to be saying. That because adversaries are doing this and that, the US has to defend forward with persistence presence. So when an adversary maneuvers, we can stay with them, right? So if US Cyber Command is watching the Russian military intelligence, and we're concerned they're going to disrupt the opening ceremonies of the Olympics, which they did in Seoul, and we see them going from a system in Korea to a system in the Netherlands, US Cyber Command wants to be able to follow them into that system in the Netherlands so we can keep an eye on them. To do that, of course, the US cyber forces require reduced operational constraints. During the Obama administration, President Obama would personally approve each and every offensive cyber operation. Under Trump, that was delegated down to the Secretary of Defense or the even one level lower to US Cyber Command itself to be able to approve some of those acts. So reduced operational constraints. With those reduced constraints, what the US Cyber Command wants to do is to get up, intercept, and halt cyber threats. If we see, for example, Russian military intelligence is going to disrupt the Olympics opening ceremony, we don't have to let them. We can disrupt that operation. They also said they want to get into, for example, Russian military intelligence, see what they're doing, and use that to improve our own defenses. It's called indications and warning. And degrade their infrastructure. So, for example, lock them out of their own malicious software so that it can't be used. And so in the short term, that should improve defenses because we're seeing what they're doing. But more, and what Cyber Command tends to talk more about is imposing friction. All right, this isn't deterrence. We're not trying to coerce them or convince them not to do something, which is what deterrence is, right? If you think about nuclear deterrence, it's we want nuclear capabilities, or Russia wants nuclear capabilities, and that we believe they have the will to use them, so that we won't use our nuclear weapons, and vice versa. That isn't this. This is directly stopping the operations by getting in and, for example, locking them out of their own malicious software, like changing the password. So now it's our software, not their software, or doing these things that you hear called botnet takedowns. Right, so it's very different than we think about for deterrence. So in the medium term, that should be tying up the adversaries, right? So now they're going to have to spend more resources on defense, right? If we disrupt their infrastructure, they have to rebuild it. So that reduces their ability to attack over the medium term. Now, again, I'm not saying it necessarily will do that, but that's the US argument. That's been the argument. And something that comes up in the academic writing, but not the military writing, is this process of tacit bargaining. If you've studied international relations, that's a phrase from Schelling. And basically it's saying on the US side that we're not sure we're ever going to come to diplomatic agreement with the Russians, Chinese, Iranians, and North Koreans on the negotiating tables of New York or Geneva. We're just never going to come to agreement on the norms of what should be allowed or not allowed in cyber conflict. The primary way, overwhelmingly the primary way, they argue, that we'll come to terms with, say, Russia, is through this process of persistent engagement. That because we're having all of these constant repeated interactions with Russian intelligence, with Russian military intelligence, with our forces, that the primary way that Russian military intelligence is going to learn what's unacceptable, such as attacking the opening ceremonies of the Olympics, is by us going after them really hard when they do that. If they're trying to disrupt the US elections, we've got to hit them as hard as we can to get them to stop. If they're doing something that's within the norms that the US espouses, like normal geopolitical intelligence, then they aren't going to get such a vicious response from the United States side. If they're merely trying to break into, for example, the Pentagon. Well, that's what we expect Russian military intelligence to do. That's what they should be doing. And so we can be upset about it, and we'll of course work to stop them, but we're not going to be so vehement as if they're trying to disrupt elections. That said, there is still some role for deterrence here. So, boy, I would say for at least 10 years, I'd say about 10 years, the United States has seen Russia and China trying to get into the US electrical grid. Well, it's nice for the president to have the option. So the US has said, all right, we'll get into your electrical grid too. So that way, if you think you can take our power down, well, we can take your power down. That affects their willingness to attack. And that is more like pure deterrence. So that's what the US lays out. Is that going to increase stability? Like diving into this game, if I drink your milkshake in cyberspace, is that going to increase stability? Don't know. All right, there's a chance, right? And I love this phrase that was in a very recent the most recent Foreign Affairs by Phil Tetlock, saying every policy is a prediction. And the policy of this persistent engagement is that the adversaries will back away. They will say, that's the way it works. Okay, I understand. But of course, the opposite could be true. They could say, why are you coming after us, United States? You're guilty of plenty yourself. And they feel that they need to step up instead of backing away. No idea, right? And anytime if you hear your government, if you're our government, if you're some academic saying it will or it won't, they have no idea. None of us have any idea. This is a brand new field. We're still in the very first decades of the very first digital century. We've got many more digital centuries to come. And so none of us can be sure about what's going to happen next. But that doesn't mean we have to throw up our hands. We can approach it in a structured way. And what that means at Columbia. And so I've done work, many of you may have heard of Bob Jervis, Professor Robert Jervis, who has done a lot of the work in all the way back to the 70s, if not before, on deterrence, on coercion, on the security dilemma. And so he and I have been looking at this, and we came up with this table that just recently got published just this fall, where we try and look at under what conditions our cyber capability is going to be escalatory or not. Because the people that are arguing for persistent engagement defend forward tend to say, look, cyber is not escalatory. That states tend to treat it as a pressure release valve. For example, Iran was mining tankers in the Gulf, like actually blowing holes in the side of oil tankers, and they shot down a US reconnaissance drone, surveillance drone. President Trump was about to order, or had ordered, an airstrike. And then when he was thought about the implications of potentially 150 dead Iranians, he called off the airstrike, but he let the cyber attack go ahead. Right? And both sides afterwards said, okay, this is done. We don't need to go any farther. We both made our point. And cyber allowed that to happen without any casualties on the Iranian side. Right? So cyber was this pressure release. Instead of building to a crisis and causing an escalation, it de-escalated. And if you read a lot of the writing from the academics and others, they're treating like cyber is almost always going to be like this. Whereas Bob and I argue, no, that only works if you're in relative peace or if both sides want to limit the conflict. Sometimes this is said because cyber tends to work as an intelligence contest, not a military contest. And in an intelligence contest, both sides kind of understand the rules and know this is not supposed to lead to major bloodshed. What Professor Jervis and I added to that argument was saying, all right, but there's other things as well. Cyber conflict in cyberspace has been intensifying over the 40 years since Cliff Stoll first started. And it might hit a place where the cyber itself causes an armed conflict, because cyber conflict is intensifying over increasingly existential issues, and someone might make a mistake or go too far, and they get a kinetic military response that causes casualties because of it, which would then be destabilizing. Bob and I called the next scenario, we called it pull out the big guns. Neither of us really liked that name, but we couldn't think about anything else. And so what we meant by this is our colleagues in academia and the military that say, look, cyber doesn't escalate, right? We use cyber back and forth, and there's never been a warlike response to a cyber attack ever. And Bob and I said, well, maybe that's because for the entire period of cyber conflict, or almost the entire period, has been post-Cold War. And in general, post-Cold War, states aren't using armed conflict to solve their problems. Actually sending tanks across the border is really rare for the past 25 years compared with the periods before. There's been a lot less armed conflict. And so maybe the fact that cyber hasn't caused an armed conflict has much less to do anything about cyber than the fact that just states aren't having those kinds of wars anymore. But if we're having more frequent geopolitical crises, US-China, US-Russia, Iran, India, Pakistan, what in the United States, we call great power competition. As we're seeing a return of great power competition, then we should expect that states are going to be less willing to see cyber as just a pressure release. And you will start seeing cyber used to cause death and destruction, which would be also destabilizing. And the last one we called the escalation avert, inversion, in that most of the dynamics of cyber conflict lead them to pressure release. But as you start getting closer towards war, or the potential for war, then, and this is captured in the theme of the digital Pearl Harbor, right? Imagine if you were, say, Iran or North Korea, and you thought war with the United States, and you thought the United States wanted war, that you were being backed into a corner where the only way you felt that you could get out was through war. Well, the United States has been pretty clear that we feel incredibly vulnerable to cyber attacks, that these are really powerful, especially early on in a crisis, that they could disrupt the US logistics, it could disrupt the power, it could disrupt the military. And we've said, boy, we're pretty vulnerable to this. If you were Iran or North Korea and you thought war was likely, then it is in your interest to not only strike first against the United States, but to do that as a major cyber strike first, to try and get your best punch in before the United States can respond. So instead of being a pressure release, it in fact becomes incredibly destabilizing. And this is just not recognized anywhere to the degree that we would like within the United States military, or in fact within the academic literature. And so this is what Bob Jervis and I were able to add. To put it visually, the United States, we like to talk about the gray zone between peace and war. So in cyber, you've got just small things like cybercrime that you don't need the military for. You've got the high end of warfare. And so the Pentagon has been pushing persistent engagement defend forward as an operational concept for here, the gray zone. They call it the fat middle. And we agree with that. Like I actually agree with that. It's actually not bad, right? If we're going to see the Russians trying to interfere with the U.S. election again, or try and disrupt the opening ceremony of the Olympics, we don't have to let them. And it's not fair to worry, oh, is that escalatory? No, right? Someone's trying to disrupt the Olympics. And by the way, right, I'm tending to use Russia in this example, but the same thing goes for the United States, right? The United States has set the status quo with our own attacks, like Snowden and Stuxnet. So I don't mean to pick on any particular country right now. However, like we said, that gray zone might be a lot thinner than we think, because as you are approaching that getting closer towards the threat of war, the chance of mistake, miscalculation, perceived first strike advantage means that cyber is going to be incredibly dangerous indeed. And so the last slide, just to close out, right? Things work differently. Deterrence and opposing costs work differently when your adversary is sure they're hitting back, not first. And without a doubt, most of the US adversaries are sure that they're hitting back, that the United States was the one that picked this fight in cyberspace, and that they're the ones that are responding to us. That can be true, that can be not true, but most of them surely believe that. Okay, and with that, that is what I have, and I think we can go to Q&A. I'm sorry, I haven't been able to follow chat just because I don't want it to, I didn't want it to take up space on the screen. Kathleen, maybe I turn it back to you to run how you'd like.
Hi, Professor Healey. Thank you so much for that presentation. Just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, you can simply put them in the chat, or if you'd like to ask them out loud, you can virtually raise your hand and we'll call on you. At this time, I see we do have one question for you, Professor Healey, which came in a few minutes ago. Should we expect more destruction in the future due to cyber threats than an actual nuclear attack? This is coming from Hamad, who I believe is in Pakistan.
Great, thanks, Hamad. Yeah, I mean, it's a question, and in fact, it goes back to all the way to the 90s. Russia in the at the United Nations came out and said that they were okay in treating, responding to a cyber attack as if it were a nuclear attack. And at the time, everyone was like, whoa, 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 like cyber can't have any kind of impact like that in the 90s, right? It just was almost unthinkable that cyber could have that kind of impact. But it was still really new and we didn't really know. more recently, the United States made the same threat of saying that, yes, we would be willing to have a nuclear response to a cyber attack. It's not quite your question, but I'm going to get there. And so I was kind of going backwards from that and saying, all right, if the United States were going to use nuclear in response to a cyber attack, tell me something smart about that cyber attack that just happened. And I could only come up with one or two things that would be that bad that we would go to nuclear. And that is the Russians. Again, I hate to be picking on Russia, but Russia has been intruding into nuclear power plants in Europe and the United States. And that is really, we've got a phrase here in New York, for those of you, if you hopefully you'll be in New York soon, that is really dangerous shit, right? That is really dangerous to be intruding into nuclear power plants, because cyber, it can get out of your control. Right? You can make mistakes. And so I could see the United States making using nuclear if the Russians intentionally or unintentionally caused a meltdown at a nuclear power plant. That said, meltdown at a nuclear power plant, I would live next to a melted down nuclear power plant any day of the week rather than living nearby to a nuclear strike. And so, yeah, cyber at its worst is nowhere near as bad as a nuclear strike, fortunately. But because cyber is so usable is where the danger comes in. Because it hasn't had any really major national security impact that's caused death and destruction, states feel like there's no upper limit on what they can use this for, or certainly states are sometimes acting like that. And that's where this danger can really come in. And Hamad, for your point, so much of the literature on this has focused on the United States, or U.S. Russia, U.S. China, and it's really we really have not paid as much attention to the regional crises, especially, for example, how this might play out with India, Pakistan, who have had a lot of cyber wars that have been called in the press going all the way back to, call it like 2000.
Thank you. I see Hannah has her hand raised. Hannah, if you don't mind simply unmuting yourself and letting us know what your question is.
Hi, thank you. And thank you, Professor Healey. This has been a really interesting talk. I wish I could have turned on my camera, but I'm a bit under the weather.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
But so I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Florida. I'm trying to figure out a thesis topic, but one of the ideas I'm really interested in is digital democracy and how non-state actors use the internet to achieve their goals. So I was wondering, because cyber seems to really eliminate borders, and it also seems to eliminate the classical idea of the state, how do you think cyber conflict will affect the goals and means of non-state actors, either non-state actors against each other's, against states? How does that affect the power imbalance and the escalation stages you talk about in your presentation?
Yeah, it's, I hear a lot of our work has been, all right, what are the dynamics of cyber conflict, right? I came into the Air Force and we said, what are the dynamics of flying and fighting in the air? You have, for example, an aircraft that's at a higher altitude has an advantage of an aircraft at a lower altitude, right? That hasn't changed since 1914. Borders are one of those that I hear a lot of people say, well, there are no borders in the internet. And that's just not true. We like to say they're fuzzy borders, right? I mean, you'll find out really quickly about the borders if you are in Beijing and you're trying to find out information about what happened in Tiananmen Square in June 1989. If you are anywhere in the world, particularly Thailand, and you try and say something about the king of Thailand. If you're anywhere in the world and you try and send child pornography, right? You'll find those borders snap down on you really, really, really quickly. And so we like to say there are these fuzzy borders. And it is certainly changing that the borders are increasing. This had been, in the United States had been all about free borders. But if you look at the latest material from the Secretary Pompeo in Trump's State Department, I mean, they are looking for almost complete split with China, right? They say we want clean telecommunications networks, and clean doesn't mean where it's not passing spam or it's not passing cyber attacks. It's saying clean is, well, we don't want any of our telecommunications networks to intercommunicate with telecommunications networks that are under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, right? I mean, it is, I mean, it's an extraordinarily extreme position. So you are going to see those borders come back in. You know, especially when I was at the White House, cybersecurity and technology policy was a subset of economic and innovation policy. And we would only get cybersecurity measures passed if they didn't detract too much from the economy or innovation. You've seen that flip now in the United States, where technology policy is a subset of national security policy. And we are willing to take economic and innovation hits to show it to China, you know, to put it on China. So how that plays out on the private sector, I've done a fair amount of writing on this, especially with a colleague named Greg Rattray, and you can look at some of our writing. And cyber is, I think it's the biggest difference with conflict in the air, land, sea, and space, right? If you're in the Army and you're rolling in with your Army, right? The non-states are trying to get out of the way, right? They're non-combatants, right? They're going to try and leave the city and get out of your path if they can. Or the civilians are there to support you, right? They're the ones that are in the chow hall, or they're helping you on maintenance or logistics. And that happens in cyber. But in cyber, right, as soon as you are, like, you've sailed past the harbor in cyberspace, again, to take a naval analogy, you're sailing in networks that were built by the private sector with their own money for their own purposes, right? You can't have cyber conflict without the networks that were built and maintained by the private sector. And that also means that it's the private sector that have the most capability on defense. Right? If I could have Cyber Command on my side or Microsoft and Google on my side, I'll pick Microsoft and Google every day of the week because they're building and maintaining cyberspace every day. And frankly, the work from Microsoft, right? Microsoft, over a decade ago, I'll call it a decade ago, set up a division to do diplomacy, right? The word diplomacy was in the name of this organization at Microsoft, because they were out and saying, here, like, hey, states, United States, China, Germany, Estonia, these are the norms that you want in cyberspace. Well, what about us? We're the ones that are building this. You're taking our tools and you're transforming them into weapons. We want a say in how that's going to happen. And the most important recent development there was the Microsoft Tech Accords, where they've now gotten dozens, if not hundreds of companies to all sign up to what they think the rules should be. For example, if there were a cyber war with the US and China, Microsoft has said, we are not going to take sides. We have customers in both places, and our job is going to be to help our customers and make sure that they are patched and they're not affected. I think that's a really, really strong position. So I think it's a great thesis.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Healey. I see we have a few questions coming in the chat. We'll try to get to as many as possible. However, we do have 10 minutes. So I'll be going back and forth between the chat and people raising their hand.
Oh my gosh. Yep.
Do you see the questions, Professor Healey?
Yep. Do you want me to just go through?
Yeah, sure. Take one.
Let me do two, and then maybe we'll take the next hand.
Okay.
All right. In the order that I see them. Catherine's, thanks for the question. Yeah, how does cyber defense and offense intersect? It's going back and forth. Even in the military, it went back and forth. The organization that I set up and then was at in 1999 was purely defense. Then they added offense in. Then we split defense and offense. Then we brought them back together in U.S. Cyber Command. but this does lead, right now it's DHS, and you might have seen Chris Krebs, he was in the news. And as a matter of fact, he spoke to our class at SEPA like the day before he got fired. And so he talked extensively about what he was going through and why he was so proud of what DHS had done for the elections. And then, boop, next day. And so you do see this, there's almost schizophrenia in the US government, because we want to do defense seriously, and we take that seriously, but we don't want to give up any of the offense advantage. So you really see how this plays out, especially in something called the Vulnerabilities Equities Program, which is how the United States decides if we discover some great new cyber vulnerability in Windows, for example, are we going to tell Microsoft about it, or are we going to keep it to ourselves to spy? That's a great, great topic, and one that we don't pay enough attention to. And other countries are about the same, like other Western countries, like the British, the Dutch, all have similar kinds of processes for that. Cybersecurity opportunities at SEPA. Because we've hired me, we're farther ahead on cybersecurity. Ooh, that sounded a lot worse than I meant it to. The dean's been trying to hire people in, and we have a lot of key person dependencies, right? There's not a lot of people that do cyber. A lot of the other schools have hired academics to do cyber, not practitioners. Like Thomas Ridd at SAIS, he is the best researcher in the world on this, but he's a researcher. I've actually done it, and I've done these jobs, and the people that I hire to teach our classes here are practitioners also. Oh, maybe I'm going to do that. So this, we just had a first semester having Adam Siegel on the Council on Foreign Relations to teach a class on East Asia cyber issues. Next semester, I've got Army Cyber Institute is going to repeat their class. It's the foundational classes. It's kind of like the basics of cybersecurity and cyber risks and vulnerabilities. One is taught by a deputy CISO of New York City, a veteran. The class that's taught by Army Cyber Institute are two Army officers, a warrant officer and a lieutenant colonel. Both of them have been deeply involved in US cyber operation, both hugely technical nerds, both women. We've got next semester the Chief Information Security Officer of UBS, the Swiss bank, is teaching on business cyber risks. Like, what's the role of the board? I'm teaching my class on dynamics of cyber conflict, and kind of the class at the peak of it is I teach with a lawyer and a computer scientist, and we have students. We have law students, computer science students, and SEPA students, and we put you together into teams so that you get exposed to these other views. Okay. And so in the other tech sectors, we're quite a bit more in energy because SEPA has such a strong energy center. I've done some in space, but space, it just hasn't come up quite as much. And we're okay on AI. We've got some classes on that. Let me just cover Sophia's, and then we'll go to Ricardo. International cybersecurity trends and strategy, plan to use domestic. Oh yeah, it works out well because what I didn't mention is kind of the digital issues, right? I'm the cyber guy. Anya Schifrin, who runs our IMAC, used to be called TMAC. So for example, I'm bringing in classes to hopefully, if you join next fall, we should have a class taught by Camille Francois, who is one of the best people in the world in tracking adversary disinformation campaigns, right? Here's what the Iranians were doing to try and influence the US election when they pretended to be the Proud Boys. Ooh, cool. Anya's classes are, all right, what's Section 230 and how does that apply into what the United States government can do to try and clamp down on disinformation? So we're pretty good on that and getting better. Thanks for being patient. I think you were next, Ricardo.
Great. I have a quick question about NSA versus Cyber Command. Do you feel like the future of U.S. cyber operations belongs more with the intelligence community or with the armed forces?
Neither. And it's an absolutely great question, and one I put a lot of time into. To me, it's the private sector. The private sector has the real capability, and so we need to engage encourage and enforce where necessary with the private sector. And to me, I only revert then back to intelligence or military on defense for the exceptions. I also prioritize the American economy and innovation, right? We need a sustainable cyberspace, right? If you think your kids are going to have an internet as good as the one we have today when they're your age, you're nuts, right? There's almost no chance. So it's not sustainable. And so like I like borrowing this imagery from the environmental movement to say, well, how can we make sure it's sustainable? How can we make sure that we're not, you know, we're all peeing in the pool, and the United States strategy is to brag about how big our bladder is. And so I certainly think we need to split the roles of Cyber Command and NSA. And for those that follow, we have given the two most powerful cyber organizations almost in the world, at least for government organizations, and they report to one person. And we say that's great because it's efficient. Well, America wasn't built to be efficient, right? Right? The Constitution was built because power can corrupt. You don't want any single person having too much power. And so I say you've got to split those two roles. And I don't care if it makes us less efficient, because it's going to make us better. And then maybe Yumi, and then I can, maybe that's going to be the last one.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. This was really interesting. I'm currently a security consultant out in the Middle East, and we've been working on sort of similar ideas out here. And one of the ideas that sort of come up is that we're starting to see these diverging paths of like the Western democracies pursuing increased openness with robust cybersecurity behind that, and then the concept of cyber sovereignty being primarily led by Russia and China. So I was wondering how that would impact the way that we have to think about cyber conflict, because like the internet is not necessarily this big connecting thing if we continue down that path.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I've, in a lot of my work, original work, it was all about, man, we've got to save cyberspace. We've got to make sure it continues to be open, free, and the rest. And in fact, that's probably going to be the name of our program, called Saving Cyberspace. In one of my favorite nerds, a guy named Bill Woodcock, and by the way, nerds is absolutely a term of endearment, is he was actually out in Berkeley. And he asked me a great question about political philosophy that I wasn't expecting to get from like an uber nerd living in Berkeley, which was, it was this political philosophy question of, well, or a religious question, like, well, are we trying to achieve heaven on earth with the internet, or are we just trying to avoid hell? And he was right? At this point, I have given up almost that the internet is going to look like it has for the past couple of decades. And we have to go for, all right, what's the best that we're likely to be able to achieve? And so my colleague at Council on Foreign Relations, a guy named Rob Kanaki, has been writing about this in, he's had a CFR report and wrote in Foreign Affairs of saying, we've got to just split off with the other democracies, and we have an internet that works well for the Western democracies. And if you're going to play by the rules, then you're allowed in. And if you're not going to play by the rules, then you're going to have difficulty trying to connect into our internet. The Japanese had a different version that Prime Minister Abe put out 3 years ago, called Digital Free Flow with Trust, of saying, of course, we want the free flow of data, but you have to have this element of trust. You know, we can't just have everything cross borders anymore. You have to have these other elements built in, which, by the way, ties us into trade policy. So our Dean Merritt Jano is actually a trade lawyer. Like she'd been a WTO appellate judge back when we used to have such a thing. And so it's a nice way to take these ideas of security and tie them in with internet governance, with sovereignty, and with cross-border digital trade. So thank you. As I see, let me just try and get some of these other questions. Actually, let me finish that thought for Yumi. And so we have to think about what's the optimal fragmentation, right? We might not be able to continue to have this absolutely free internet anymore. We're going to have to start thinking of what's the best we're going to be able to achieve, and how can we get there? How does that fit in with what we want? Okay, Indu, I thought had a great point, because I can tie it back to Microsoft. A lot of what Microsoft has been doing has been, how does this affect individuals? It's a great point. They helped set up a place in Geneva called the Cyber Peace Institute. So if you're interested in what's the impact on individuals, what's the impact on at-risk populations, like activists and journalists and religious, ethnic, cultural minorities and states, and how cyber is used on them, check out that Digital Peace Institute, Cyber Peace Institute, sorry. Also the work at the University of Toronto, Monk Center has done a lot of work on that. Yeah, the IGOs on peacekeeping initiatives have been interesting in this space, but they haven't had a big role. If you're interested in your studies of looking at conflict resolution, which SIPA is about to do a lot more on, we have not done any work that I know of, any useful, reasonable work that has taken, here are the tools and the methodologies and the canon of conflict resolution. How can those be applied to cyber? We're using the tools of international relation, right? Where we talk about coercion. We're not talking about conflict resolution. And Digital Pearl Harbor, that came up, the phrase just got used this week again about electronic Pearl Harbor. The phrase actually goes back to June 1991. So we've been worrying about an electronic Pearl Harbor of 29 of the 79 years since the actual Pearl Harbor. It can be, like, I wasn't a fan of that phrase, Christoph, when I was doing like my history book, right? I was like, all right, we keep worrying about an electronic Pearl Harbor. It hasn't happened yet. Maybe we need to rethink this. I've now flipped, because now all my colleagues, instead of saying we got to worry about a digital Pearl Harbor, I was now saying a digital Pearl Harbor is nonsense. So we need to stop talking about it, right? The point that we're making with the escalation inversion is, yes, under normal circumstances, don't worry about a digital Pearl Harbor, right? We're not going to do a massive cyber strike against China completely out of the blue, and they're not going to do it against us. The world just doesn't work that way, right? They're deterred. All of the other means of international relations play out. However, once we are getting close to conflict, we do really need to be keeping in mind that thinking about someone trying to get that strike, and they might think that we are going to do that strike against them, right? If you think war is likely on Saturday, then you want to get your cyber strike in on Friday. If you think the other folks are going to get in their cyber strike on Friday, you need to get yours in on Thursday. And right, so you can see how that's going to lead itself to escalation and instability. Sorry, we can't get to the other questions, but I think we did pretty well. Over to you, Kathleen.
Yes, we did. Thank you so much, Professor Healey. I think that was a great presentation, and you know, everyone had such good questions. Thank you again for remaining engaged with us. I hope you continue to follow us on social media and to see what we're doing in the next coming weeks. Again, I want to thank you on behalf of admissions, Professor Healey, for this initiative. And yes. Yep.
And so I really hope to see you as students at SIPA, regardless of whether you're taking cyber or not. You know, if you've been doing a lot of these, you'll find that, I mean, I didn't know what I was getting at Columbia, right? I didn't quite know how good it was. Only fine to get here and realize, like, I'm all of a sudden playing on the Yankees, right? I'm playing for Arsenal. Like, I'm surrounded by the best people in the world, which I'm thrilled to be here. I would love to see you as students. I can't wait for you to be colleagues, hopefully in the cyber field alongside with me. There's a lot of great jobs. The salaries are good. So I do hope you'll join us. Either way, congratulations on wherever you go.
Thank you. Where can folks go if they're interested in learning more about the work that you're doing and the courses that you're teaching besides the website? Is there any other resources that you would recommend?
I think the website is fine. And we did an admissions blog last year that talked about the books that you can read, the online courses that you can take, you know, regardless of whether you're doing that to prep for coming to SIPA, or if you are, you know, just want to maybe do some cyber, be a little bit cyber smarter. Great, thanks for posting that, Emily. Yeah, that blog will give some of the best tips.
Awesome. Thank you so much again,
Thanks.
and enjoy the rest of your Friday, everyone. Bye.